I was sipping my second cup of coffee on a peaceful Saturday morning when 3 gunshots cracked through the air like someone had declared war on my cornfield. I jumped so hard I spilled coffee on my pajama pants. I own 30 acres of quiet, rural bliss just outside city limits, and this sort of thing doesn't happen here. The deer are usually more polite. I grabbed my boots and ran toward the field, heart pounding and half expecting to find poachers or some wild animal encounter gone wrong. Instead, I stumbled into the most ridiculous chaos imaginable. A group of camouflage-clad yahoos were standing around a smoldering luxury SUV riddled with buckshot. Karen, the president of our HOA and full-time self-declared neighborhood queen, was screaming at them like a banshee in high heels, and the hunters were just standing there scratching their heads like they were confused why the deer didn't run after they shot it. One of them even mumbled that the chrome grille looked like antlers in the fog. That's when I realized they'd shot Karen's own Range Rover on my land, and somehow she'd convinced them this field belonged to her. The absurdity of it all took a second to register. Karen was yelling something about trespassing, except the hunters were shouting back that she'd invited them. One of them waved a wrinkled flyer that looked like it had been printed from Microsoft Paint. It had a fake HOA logo on top and said Hunters Welcome in bold red letters with Karen's signature scrawled underneath. I stared at the paper and then back at her, trying to piece it together, when she caught sight of me and her face dropped. I must have looked like a ghost walking out of the morning mist, because the next thing she said was, "Oh great, he's here." She actually said that like I was the problem. I asked them all to step away from the vehicle, partly for safety and partly because I wanted to check the damage. Her SUV looked like it had been in a low-budget action film. The front was peppered with holes, the side mirror was dangling like a loose tooth, and the windshield had a spiderweb crack that could only be described as artistic if you were blind. I turned to Karen and calmly asked what was going on. She huffed and pointed at me like I was the intruder, yelling that she had every right to use the field since it was part of the community trust. That was news to me, since I bought the land outright 5 years ago and had the title deed hanging in my office. I told her she'd made a mistake. A very expensive one. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she doubled down. She said the field wasn't being used, and the HOA board voted to temporarily lease it for community enrichment activities. I nearly laughed. Hunting with drunk strangers wasn't exactly enriching. Then I looked at the hunters, one of whom was holding a can of beer and wearing flip-flops, and said sarcastically, "Yeah, this looks real enriching." One of them nodded, thinking I was agreeing with him. That's the level of genius we were dealing with. I told them all they were trespassing and needed to leave immediately. Karen crossed her arms and barked that she wasn't going anywhere until someone paid for her car. I reminded her that it was shot on my land by people she invited. She replied that if I hadn't made my field look so deserted, maybe they wouldn't have mistaken her SUV for a deer. That's when I started to lose my patience. I asked one of the hunters where they got the permit, and he handed me the flyer. I turned it over and on the back, in glitter pen of all things, was a note, valid for all activities approved by the HOA Queen. Karen had literally crowned herself on official documentation. I took out my phone, snapped a photo of it, and said thanks, this will be great in court. Karen's eyes went wide and she tried to snatch it back, but I pulled away. That's when I told her something that finally shut her up. I used to be the state's wildlife commissioner. I know every hunting regulation, property law, and conservation statute in the book. And what she'd done wasn't just stupid. It was criminal. Unauthorized hunting. Endangering others. Falsifying documents. Misuse of HOA power. Trespassing. I started listing them one by one, and by the fifth charge, her jaw dropped open like someone had pulled the rug out from under her entitlement. The hunters realized things were getting serious and started backing away. One of them asked if they were going to jail. I said not today, but your weapons will be confiscated and your names reported to the local ranger station. I wasn't bluffing. I had contacts, and within the hour, 2 game wardens were on their way. Karen started to protest again, saying she'd fix it, maybe offer me a small percentage of the HOA fund to keep quiet. That was her idea of damage control. Bribery with other people's money. I told her to get off my land and not to come back until she had a lawyer. She stomped away, climbed into the passenger side of her destroyed SUV, and ordered one of the hunters to drive. He looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole, but he obeyed. As they pulled away, the bumper clunked onto the dirt, barely hanging on, and I shook my head. What kind of lunatic sets up a hunting trip in someone else's field and then blames the landowner when it backfires? As I stood there, watching the tailpipe dangle like a sad wind chime, I thought it couldn't get worse. But then my phone rang. It was my neighbor, Mitch. He asked if I was okay, and said there were rumors that Karen had tried to lease out his alpaca sanctuary next. That's when I realized this wasn't an isolated act of stupidity. This was a pattern, and Karen was just getting started. By the time the dust had settled on the absurd chaos that morning, word had already begun to spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. I didn't have to post a thing online because someone from the nearby hiking trail had filmed part of the scene, especially the moment Karen screamed at the hunters and pointed wildly at her bullet-riddled Range Rover. That video hit our community Facebook group within the hour, and by noon it had over 200 comments, mostly a mix of stunned disbelief and popcorn emojis. But instead of laying low and letting the heat die down like a normal person might, Karen did what Karen always did. She doubled down, then tripled down, and somewhere along the line completely detached herself from reality. She called for an emergency HOA board meeting and insisted it be held on the community lawn, right across from my driveway. Apparently, the clubhouse wasn't dramatic enough for her taste. I decided to attend, mostly out of morbid curiosity, but also because I wanted to make sure she didn't try to spin things her way. When I got there, I knew immediately that it wasn't going to be a normal meeting. Karen had set up a foldable podium with fake velvet drapes, like she was running for some sort of suburban office, and stood there holding a clipboard like it was a sacred scroll. A small crowd of residents had gathered, some in lawn chairs, some just standing around unsure if this was a meeting or a comedy performance. Karen opened the event by saying she had a very serious community update regarding safety protocols and neighborhood enrichment. That was her phrase of the day, neighborhood enrichment. I stood near the back, arms folded, waiting for the inevitable dumpster fire to begin. She started by claiming that the hunting incident was blown out of proportion by people who didn't understand the nuance of rural land management. She said she had simply tried to organize an educational hunting workshop for select community members, and that it had been sabotaged by misinformation and false accusations. That's when I raised my hand. She ignored me. I raised it again. She finally pointed at me and said if I had something constructive to add, I could wait until public comment. Public comment. She really thought this was Congress. So I walked up to the front, not waiting for permission, and calmly asked one question. Who authorized the use of my field for this so-called workshop? She shifted uncomfortably and replied that the board had discussed the possibility of expanding recreational access. I asked again, who gave written permission to allow hunting on land that does not belong to the HOA? She looked toward 2 board members who immediately began staring at their shoes. It became very clear that Karen had acted alone. I pulled out my phone and showed the audience the forged flyer with her glitter pen signature. The room went silent. Someone gasped. A kid in the back said "dang" loud enough for everyone to hear. Karen tried to snatch the phone from my hand, claiming it was doctored, but it was too late. The crowd had seen it. Then the real unraveling began. One of the other HOA board members, Linda, finally spoke up. She said that not only was the flyer news to her, but she also found a charge on the HOA's shared debit account labeled event insurance for outdoor activity. Karen had used HOA funds to cover her fake hunting day. The insurance company had even flagged the request as suspicious because it didn't include a verified location. Karen tried to spin it again, saying the community deserved unique experiences, and she had tried to create something special. I reminded her that what she created was a near disaster: property damage, illegal firearm use, and potential injury. Her SUV had been turned into Swiss cheese. What if that had been a person? What if it had been a kid playing near the edge of the woods? That's when the residents really began turning. One by one, people stood up and started voicing other complaints. Apparently, Karen had a habit of bending rules and calling it leadership. She once canceled a community Halloween party because she didn't like the theme. Another time she repainted the front gate without approval and billed the HOA for the paint, and it turned out to be glitter paint, which still sparkled under sunlight like a Vegas sign. The list of her antics grew longer and louder, and Karen's once confident smirk began to twitch. She tried to gavel the meeting closed, even though she didn't have a gavel, and the only thing she managed to bang was the edge of her clipboard, which snapped in half dramatically. She shouted that the meeting was over, that she wouldn't be slandered in public, and then stormed off, but not before tripping over a lawn sprinkler head, causing a light spray to soak her shoes and pants. It was the kind of poetic timing you don't often get in real life. The meeting might have ended, but the real storm was just beginning. The next day, HOA residents started digging. Some of them formed an informal audit group and began reviewing past meeting minutes, HOA expenses, and neighborhood project record. What they uncovered was a mess of questionable charges, unauthorized decisions, and shady communications. Karen had been using her title like a personal ATM and had created a web of nonsense policies to justify it. Even worse, someone found a draft document on the HOA shared cloud drive labeled Private Event Waiver Template where Karen had outlined how to create fake event coverage without board review. It was clearly her formatting, her language, and her signature in the footer. Meanwhile, the hunters who had shot her car were facing consequences of their own. Turns out, 2 of them were on probation for unrelated charges, and being caught with firearms on private land was a violation. The game warden cited them and confiscated their weapons. One of them tried to blame Karen directly, saying she'd promised full legal protection and told them the land was open and regularly used for seasonal training. Seasonal training for what? I asked when I was interviewed by the local newspaper. Competitive trespassing, that quote made it into the article's headline. Karen, ever the queen of damage control, tried to win back the community by announcing she would host a neighborhood barbecue to make amends. But no one showed up except one confused pizza delivery guy who left with 3 plates of ribs and a confused expression. The rest of us were too busy organizing a formal vote of no confidence, set for next week's official HOA meeting. Karen had gone from untouchable to radioactive in just 3 days. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because people like Karen don't go down easy. They regroup, they spin, and they strike back. And the next move she made would be her most desperate yet. 2 days after Karen's soggy barbecue flop, I was out in the yard fixing a wire fence when a buzzing noise overhead made me look up. A consumer-grade drone was hovering directly above my property line, drifting left and right like it was scanning. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor kid was just flying it around, but then the drone descended slightly and paused midair, right above the boundary between my field and the HOA-controlled park zone. Suspicious didn't even begin to cover it. I took a picture of it with my phone, then watched as it zipped away toward Karen's house like it had found what it came for. Later that evening, I found a folded notice in my mailbox. It wasn't stamped or addressed through the post office. It looked homemade, printed in all caps, and covered in red ink. The top read "Cease and desist trespassing on HOA land." The signature at the bottom? Karen, with her usual excessive loops and a glitter pen swipe. She had gone from pretending my field was hers to now accusing me of stepping onto her imaginary border. That drone wasn't just for spying. It was her way of creating fake surveillance footage for a legal trap. I couldn't believe the gall. Not only had she forged access rights for the hunters, spent HOA money without approval, and nearly gotten someone killed, Now she was trying to claim my own land as HOA territory. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so potentially serious. Land disputes, even fabricated ones, can tie up property owners in court for months, sometimes years. I wasn't about to let Karen create that mess. The next morning, I made a few calls to an old friend who happened to be a land surveyor for the county. By noon, we were standing in my backyard with GPS-calibrated equipment, orange stakes, and official boundary maps from the county land office. It didn't take long to confirm what I already knew. Every inch of that field was mine, legally registered, and had been for 5 years. We marked the lines in bright paint and placed high-visibility survey flags along the edge. While we were still working, Karen marched over in her signature visor and wedge sandals, holding a stack of documents that flapped dramatically in the wind. She shouted from 10 feet away, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. My surveyor friend calmly explained we were verifying official property lines. She responded by waving a piece of paper in the air, saying she had HOA documents that proved the field was part of the communal buffer zone. He asked if the documents were legally registered with the county. She hesitated, then changed the subject to how we were damaging park aesthetics. I told her point-blank that the survey markers were staying, and if she removed even one, I'd report it as tampering with legal boundary evidence. Her face twitched as she turned around and stomped off. That same evening, the first 2 flags disappeared. I didn't wait. I called in the county office and filed an official complaint. Tampering with survey markers isn't just petty, it's illegal. I also sent in photos, time-stamped drone footage, and a copy of the cease and desist notice she'd slipped into my mailbox. The county officials assured me they'd take it seriously and investigate. Meanwhile, I decided to send my own cease and desist letter, this time prepared properly through my lawyer and hand-delivered to Karen's door. She refused to take it and slammed the door in the courier's face. That was her idea of a defense. But I wasn't the only one getting tired of her antics. The rest of the HOA board had been growing more uneasy with every move she made. Linda, the one who had spoken up during the public meeting, arranged a closed-door session for concerned residents and board members. She invited me to speak about the ongoing harassment and false boundary claims. I showed up with maps, receipts, copies of emails Karen had sent to the hunters, and even the surveillance drone photo. The presentation turned into a full exposé. By the time I was done, the room was buzzing with energy. People were no longer just annoyed. They were angry. Turns out, I wasn't the only one she'd tried to intimidate. One neighbor had caught Karen sneaking into their backyard taking photos of their deck, because it had unapproved lighting. Another found out she'd been charging fines for violations that didn't exist and pocketing the payments in a cash envelope labeled HOA Petty Cash. It was Linda who finally said what everyone was thinking. We need to remove her. Not just from the board, but from any position of control. The HOA bylaws allowed for a special vote of no confidence if 1/3 of the neighborhood submitted signed grievances. The vote would be legally binding, and Karen would be permanently barred from holding any position of leadership in the community. Within 2 days, we had more than enough signatures. And that's when Karen panicked. Instead of waiting for the vote to happen, she tried to retaliate. One morning, a team of unfamiliar contractors showed up and began digging small trenches along the border of my field. I asked them what they were doing, and one said they were hired to move the HOA irrigation system. That's when I noticed something worse. Karen was trying to create a false boundary, complete with pipes and plastic fencing, to make it look like her land overlapped mine. I stopped them immediately and called the sheriff's office. By the time the deputy arrived, Karen was pacing at the site, barking orders and waving blueprints she'd clearly drawn herself. The deputy asked her for official permit. She didn't have any. The contractors packed up and left once they realized the whole operation was illegal. But the deputy stayed to write up a report, and Karen was issued a formal warning. Just when I thought it couldn't escalate any further, it did. That night, one of the survey flags was replaced. Not with another flag, but with a pink plastic flamingo holding a sign that said HOA wins in gold marker. That's when I knew she wasn't just delusional, she was actively trying to provoke me. But she'd overplayed her hand. The sheriff's report, the surveyor's documents, the drone footage, and the HOA board's own investigation all painted the same picture. Karen had crossed every line imaginable, figuratively and literally. The next HOA meeting was scheduled to be held at the clubhouse, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The board had approved the vote of no confidence, and the ballots were ready. Karen, sensing that her throne was crumbling, made one last desperate move to save herself. She sent out a newsletter titled Protect Our Vision, in which she accused me of being a government plant sent to disrupt the suburban order. She said I was weaponizing bureaucracy and using manipulation tactics to destabilize the community. Some residents laughed so hard they printed it out and framed it. Others were just fed up. Whatever fantasy world Karen thought she was running, the real world was catching up fast. And the next meeting would be the moment everything unraveled for good. The clubhouse was packed wall to wall. Folding chairs lined every square inch of the tiled floor, people were standing along the back wall with arms crossed, and even some kids were perched near the juice dispenser, clearly sensing that something entertaining was about to go down. The buzz in the air wasn't your typical HOA boredom, it was anticipation. The kind of low hum that fills a courtroom right before a big verdict. Karen had positioned herself at the front, sitting stiffly in a chair that someone had clearly dragged up like a makeshift throne. She wore a navy pantsuit 2 sizes too small and clutched a binder full of what she claimed were defense documents. The room went quiet when Linda stood and tapped the microphone. No one had to ask what was about to happen. Everyone knew this was it. The official vote of no confidence was underway, and Karen was at the center of a storm she no longer controlled. Linda opened the meeting with a brief timeline of events. She kept her tone professional, but it was impossible not to hear the sharp edge of frustration woven into her words. From the unauthorized hunting fiasco to the forged documents, the misuse of HOA funds, the illegal land boundary tampering, and the ridiculous pink flamingo marker, she listed everything with dates, evidence, and witnesses. When she got to the drone surveillance and forged cease and desist notice, even people who'd been quiet before started shaking their heads. One man muttered unbelievable under his breath. Another said she belongs in a reality show. But Karen didn't flinch. She sat upright, jaw clenched, arms folded tightly across her chest like the whole world was just failing to recognize her genius. When it was finally her turn to respond, she stood dramatically and opened her binder as if revealing secrets. She began with a rehearsed speech about vision and unity, about strong leadership and the burdens of responsibility. Then she turned on the crowd. She accused the board of turning on her because they were jealous of her organizational skills. She claimed I had orchestrated a campaign of slander against her and hinted that I was part of a broader government surveillance network planted to seize suburban property. Someone in the audience laughed. She spun toward the sound and shouted that her emails had been hacked and her HOA group texts were infiltrated by bot. The laughter grew louder. She kept going. She even held up a printed meme someone had posted mocking her SUV being shot and declared it psychological warfare. Linda politely asked her to return to the point. Karen slammed her binder shut and declared she refused to be a scapegoat. The vote began. It was done with slips of paper dropped into a clear acrylic box to prevent accusations of fraud. People lined up quietly, many shaking their heads or rolling their eyes as they cast their vote. Even some of her former supporters looked ashamed. I watched the whole thing from the back of the room, arms crossed, feeling like the ending of a very long and absurd chapter was near. When the votes were counted, the results were read aloud. Out of 117 total votes, 103 were for removal, 12 against, and 2 were blank. Karen stood motionless, her face frozen, as Linda announced that the vote passed. Effective immediately, Karen was removed from her position as HOA president and permanently barred from running for any board position in the future. It was over. But of course, Karen didn't accept it that easily. She stood and shouted that the vote was rigged, that the ballots were pre-filled, and that her constitutional rights had been violated. She demanded a revote, a recount, and a federal investigation into HOA bias. Linda calmly told her that if she had legal concerns, she was welcome to consult a lawyer. Karen then stormed out of the clubhouse, knocking over the sign and sheet table with a loud crash. No one moved to help her. Instead, people slowly turned back to the front and began discussing how to move forward. New leadership, new policies, transparency. Things the community hadn't had for a long time. But Karen wasn't done. The very next morning, a local news crew showed up at my property line. Apparently, Karen had called them claiming she was the victim of community harassment and unlawful land seizure. She told them she had exclusive footage of a rogue landowner trying to build a private airstrip on HOA Greenbelt land. The reporter looked confused but intrigued. When they showed up at my house, I met them at the gate and explained the real story. Then I took them out to the field where the alleged airstrip was being built. There was nothing but grass, survey flags, and a deer feeder. The crew laughed, shook their heads, and said this wasn't what they were told to expect. I handed them a folder with legal documentation, county records, photos, and a copy of Karen's forged flyer inviting hunters. The anchor asked if they could interview me for a short segment. I agreed, on the condition that they highlight the HOA's vote and show how the neighborhood had come together to stop abuse of power. They agreed. The next day, the story aired on the evening news under the segment title Wild Shots and Wilder Claims Suburban Showdown. It featured footage from the original hunting incident, the clubhouse meeting, and a brief clip of me calmly explaining land ownership law. Karen had also been interviewed, but her footage mostly featured her shouting about infiltration and suburban warfare while slamming a binder on her front lawn. Public response wasn't in her favor. Memes spread again. One of them showed her holding her broken binder with the caption Suburban Napoleon. Someone made a t-shirt design that said I survived HOA Karen's hunting trip. The final nail in the coffin came a few days later. A new neighbor who had just moved in discovered a strange clause in their HOA welcome packet. It claimed all backyard furniture had to be pre-approved by a committee Karen had made up, called the Visual Harmony Task Force. It was complete nonsense. That discovery triggered a full audit of all past HOA decisions Karen had overseen. The audit uncovered fabricated fines, fake inspections, and unauthorized spending on things like monogrammed HOA towels and a Bluetooth speaker labeled Karen's orders only. The community rallied to clean up the mess. New board elections were held. Linda was appointed interim president. Transparency rules were adopted, and several neighbors who had never been involved before volunteered to join committees. For the first time in years, people felt hopeful. They planted flowers, hosted a potluck, even repainted the front sign to remove Karen's personal touches. And as for Karen, she disappeared from public view. Her Range Rover was towed weeks later, still riddled with bullet holes. Rumors spread that she was planning a comeback, but no one took it seriously anymore. Her power was gone, her throne dismantled, and the only thing she ruled now was a yard full of flamingo decorations and bitter memories. Still, I kept my trail cams active and my lawyer on speed dial. Because people like Karen didn't just give up. They waited. They schemed. But this time, the neighborhood was ready. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood gradually returned to a sense of normalcy that hadn't been felt in years. Without Karen's iron grip over every decision, people began to breathe again. Yards once cited for imaginary violations were thriving with individuality, kids were playing in the park without being scolded for stepping off the sidewalk, and for the first time, the HOA actually felt like it belonged to the community instead of a single, unhinged ruler. But even in the calm, a quiet tension remained. Everyone had the same unspoken thought: Karen wasn't the kind to vanish completely. And right on cue she returned, but not in the way anyone expected. It started during a weekend community tour of my newly restored field. With the drama behind us, I'd decided to convert part of my land into a wildlife learning area, complete with bird feeders, native plant restoration patches, and benches carved by a local artisan. Families had been invited to walk the trail and learn about conservation. Kids held clipboards with scavenger hunt lists, and parents took pictures near the spot where Karen's SUV had once been riddled with buckshot. I even placed a tongue-in-cheek plaque near the area that read "Caution, wild ideas may backfire." It got a few laughs and helped everyone process what we'd all endured. But in the middle of that peaceful event, someone spotted a strange figure lurking at the far end of the trail. She wore a large trench coat, oversized sunglasses, and a wide-brimmed hat tilted low over her face. At first glance, she might have passed for an eccentric birdwatcher, until one of the kids tugged on their mom's arm and said loudly, "That's the bad lady from the video." The woman froze. Slowly, the sunglasses dropped just low enough to reveal a familiar scowl. Karen. She had tried to sneak back into the field she'd once falsely claimed as hers, under the illusion that a costume could protect her from public memory. But memory in a small community is long and sharp. Within seconds, people began murmuring, then whispering and finally pointing. Karen spun around and tried to disappear into the trees, but unfortunately for her, I had recently installed motion-activated sprinklers along the trail edges to deter raccoons and deer. The system was still armed. As she stepped too close, the sensor beeped, and a jet of cold water sprayed her square in the back, causing her to shriek and tumble into a low bush. A neighbor offered to help her up, but Karen slapped his hand away and stood on her own, soaked and seething. Her hat was ruined, her coat heavy with water, and her disguise useless. She shouted that this was all a setup, that we'd orchestrated a public ambush to humiliate her. I calmly told her she wasn't welcome here and reminded her that she was trespassing on private land. She yelled that this land belonged to the community, to the spirit of HOA unity, and began reciting the bylaws from memory as if that gave her some divine right to reclaim power. Someone filmed the whole thing. Within an hour, it was posted online with the caption, "HOA Karen returns like a soaked ninja." After the incident, I filed an official trespassing report. That made the third documented complaint in a month. The sheriff's deputy who responded to the call shook his head and told her flat out she had no claim here, no authority, and if she stepped foot on my property again, she'd be arrested. Karen argued for another 20 minutes before finally storming off, dripping and defeated. But that wasn't the end. 3 days later, a glossy flyer appeared in every neighbor's mailbox. It looked professionally made and featured Karen standing in front of a podium with the headline "Restore Order." She was apparently launching her own organization separate from the HOA called the Suburban Renewal Council. The flyer listed wild promises: mandatory color palettes for mailboxes, leaf blower curfews, and a new patrol system of volunteer observers to maintain neighborhood purity. People laughed, but then a few realized she was actually serious. One resident found her trying to organize a meeting in the park gazebo with strangers from out of town who had responded to a Craigslist post titled "Seeking Visionaries for Community Takeover." Linda called an emergency meeting with the sheriff's office, who reviewed the flyers and confirmed that while the group wasn't technically illegal, it had no jurisdiction, no support, and could be shut down if it harassed residents. Karen was issued one final warning. That warning might have been the only thing that kept her quiet for a few more days, until she made the mistake that finally ended everything. In a desperate attempt to regain influence, Karen staged a dramatic announcement at the HOA's monthly gala. The event had been organized to celebrate the neighborhood's turnaround, featuring local food trucks, a small concert, and community award. Halfway through the event, Karen walked on stage uninvited, grabbed the microphone, and declared she was reclaiming her title by public demand. Her voice echoed awkwardly as the band fell silent. She revealed a banner that read "Future HOA Leadership Auction" and then unveiled what she claimed was the highlight of the evening: a ceremonial deed granting development rights to the very field where she'd first unleashed the hunter group. What she didn't realize was that the local fire chief, county commissioner, and even a state legislator were attending that night. The fake deed she held up had a forged county seal and a bogus parcel number. It wasn't just ridiculous, it was criminal. The commissioner walked right up on stage, took the document and looked it over. Then he turned to the audience and announced that this was a clear case of document forgery and attempted fraudulent property transfer. The fire chief radioed for law enforcement immediately. Karen tried to flee the scene but was stopped by two plainclothes officers who'd been helping with event security. She was escorted off the stage in front of the entire neighborhood. Phones recorded every second. The footage made local and then state news. Headlines ran for days. Former HOA president arrested after forged land auction stunt. HOA Karen tried to sell what she didn't own. Even late-night comedy shows picked it up. The internet crowned her the empress of entitlement. She was charged with multiple counts of fraud, trespassing, and misuse of official document. Her bail was denied due to her history of repeat infractions. And finally, the saga came to an end. In the months that followed, the neighborhood fully recovered. A new HOA board was elected, filled with reasonable, grounded individuals who actually listened. The field was named a community landmark, not for what it had suffered, but for how it had united the residents. A wooden sign was placed at the entrance, hand-carved and proudly displayed. It read "The field that fired back." Beneath it was a smaller line: "No hunting, no fraud, no Karens." The community smiled every time they passed it. And me, I just sat on my porch, coffee in hand, listening to the peaceful sounds of the morning without the crack of gunfire or the chaos of HOA madness. Peace, at last, was mine.